Long before the Renaissance lit up Europe, the lamps of knowledge were already burning bright in the Muslim world. In this deep dive, based on Chapter 3 of Zafarullah Khan's Islam in the Contemporary World, we rediscover Islam's transformative contributions to science, medicine, and ethical thought, and ask how this legacy can guide a new future. Welcome.
Glad to be diving in.
So we're plunging into this specific chapter, really focusing on a period that often gets overlooked in the standard histories, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. A time when Islamic civilization wasn't just, around. It was actively leading, pushing boundaries in so many fields.
And our mission here is basically to unpack what the source material tells us about these contributions.
Exactly. It's not just about what they achieved, but how they took ancient knowledge, Greek, Indian, Persian, and didn't just preserve it, but really built something new on top of it. That's the core argument.
And the scale is it's quite something. The author highlights how crucial the translation of these works into Latin was, particularly around the 12th, 13th centuries.
A pivotal moment. It essentially acted as a major bridge, feeding directly into what became the European Renaissance. It was a massive transfer of knowledge, of methods, of ideas.
Kind of laying the groundwork then.
You could definitely say that. It helped set the stage for Europe's own burst of development later on.
Okay, so context established. The source uses that really strong quote from Will Durant.
Oh, yeah, the one about Islam leading the world for 5 centuries.
That's the one. From 700 to 1200, Islam led the world in power, order, and extent of government, in refinement of manners, scholarship, and philosophy. That's quite a statement.
It really is. And the author suggests the best way to understand that leadership is to look at it through sort of 2 main lenses: the moral and ethical impact, and then the intellectual and scientific one.
Right. Let's start with that moral and ethical dimension then. The source puts a huge emphasis on values.
Yeah, it does. It frames values as absolutely essential, not just nice ideas, but the actual guiding principles for how society functions: family, community, business, everything.
These ethical values are tied to moral standards, responsibility, conscience, basically, that ability to know right from wrong.
And the purpose, according to the source, is achieving fairness, building a good society, and also, crucially, maintaining the right relationship with the Creator.
The author even brings in that Chinese proverb about righteousness in the heart leading to world peace, connecting inner values to the bigger picture.
Right. And the argument is that Islam really deepened this, gave it a strong spiritual grounding and internal motivation. It wasn't just about outward rules, but about purifying the inner self, moving away from, say, anger and envy towards patience, love, that sort of thing.
Which leads us to this concept the source calls God consciousness. That's pretty central.
It absolutely is. The source presents it as having this profound psychological and sociological impact. It contrasts it with, well, some pre-Islamic views where maybe the divine felt a bit distant from everyday life, or philosophy didn't really change how people behave day to day.
But Islam introduced God as, a living reality.
Yeah.
As something deeply felt.
Exactly, permeating body and soul. The source highlights divine attributes: beneficence, mercy, sustainer, protector, peace-giving, and points to that Quranic verse, 2.138, about being dyed in God's color, essentially internalizing these qualities.
So faith becomes intrinsic, not just belief, but who you are, leading to what the source calls a pious, dignified, and graceful version of humanity. It mentions verses connecting fearing God with restraining desires.
Cortland 79.40.
Yeah, and knowledge leading to God consciousness.
35.28.
And dignity being tied to this consciousness.
49.36. And then there's the Prophet's advice quoted: fear Allah because it is the head of everything. It's presented as the absolute foundation for the moral shift.
Okay, so how does that deep awareness then translate into things like moral courage and integrity in practice?
Well, the source links it directly to developing really strong willpower and, maybe more importantly, a powerful capacity for self-criticism. It uses the term nas lawama, the ever-repenting conscience, like an internal auditor.
Keeping people accountable even when no one's looking. The source even says this sometimes led people to confess wrongdoing and seek punishment.
That's what it claims, yeah. That this internal standard led to incredibly high levels of trustworthiness, integrity, decency, both in public and private. And crucially, it argues this freed people from being sort of enslaved to worldly things, earthly gods, as it puts it, rulers, status, wealth. The awe of God just overshadowed all that.
The source uses that story of Rabi ibn Mir before the Persian general Rustam. That's a really vivid illustration.
It is, isn't it? You picture the simply dressed envoy walking into this incredibly opulent Persian court, banners, gold, the works, and he's completely unfazed. Apparently walks right across the expensive carpets, even poking them with his spear straight towards Rustam.
And his reason for being there, the quote is powerful. "We have been sent by Allah to rid his men from the slavish bonds of their fellow men, take them out from this narrow, limited world, deliver them from the oppression of false religions, and bring them under the just rule of Islam."
That really captures the essence of the motivation the source is describing. This deep spiritual drive, this focus on the hereafter, it made them apparently quite fearless when facing worldly power, almost indifferent to material things.
The source even brings in poetry from Iqbal about this intense love for God, making the heart indifferent to both worlds.
Right, suggesting that focusing on God actually makes navigating this life harder in a way because worldly attractions lose their power.
And it shares those anecdotes about longing for death, which sounds jarring, maybe, but it's presented as extreme spiritual courage.
Yeah, like Hazrat Anas ibn Nazar at the Battle of Uhud, supposedly smelling the fragrance of paradise before being martyred. Or Hazrat Umar ibn Hammam al-Ansari, who was eating dates, heard about paradise and just threw them down to rush into battle. These stories illustrate the depth of that conviction.
It paints a picture of incredible conviction. So how did this internal piety lead to what the source calls self-surrender and marifa, knowledge of God?
It's presented as a kind of natural outcome. This deep piety fosters a willingness to completely surrender to God's will, giving up personal desires, becoming his bondsman, as the source puts it. Your life, your property, it all belongs to God.
Like that story of Fudala ibn Umair, who initially wanted to kill the prophet.
Exactly. The source uses that to show the transformative power. The prophet puts his hand on his chest, and instantly Fudala's hate turns to love, and he abandons his old ways.
And marifa itself, it's not just book learning, is it?
No, not at all. It's described as a true, deep, almost intuitive understanding of God and life's ultimate purpose. It quotes Quran 51.56. "I only created the jinn and mankind that they might serve me," framing marifa as realizing that purpose. It's about the life of the heart focused on God, illuminated by him. The source distinguishes between intellectual knowledge, ilmi, and this emotional, experiential knowing, hali.
That's a profound personal change. But how did it impact society more broadly? The source emphasizes collective responsibility.
Right, this is presented as a really key aspect. Islam wasn't just about individual piety. It laid down rules for how society should function, relationships, rights, obligations within families, communities, even between nations.
It quotes the Quran, 9.71, about believers being protecting friends who enjoin the right and forbid the wrong.
And that passage in Surah 107 sharply criticizing those who ignore orphans and the needy. These verses, plus hadith, underline this interconnectedness, like the famous hadith comparing believers to one body. If one part aches, the whole feels it.
The shepherd analogy, too. Everyone's responsible for their flock.
Exactly. The ruler for the people, the man for his family, the woman for her household, and so on. Everyone is accountable. And that boat parable is so clear.
Right, people wanting to drill a hole in their section of the boat.
But not realizing it sinks everyone. The point being, individual actions have collective consequences, and there's a shared duty to stop harmful behavior for the good of all. Even helping the oppressor, according to one hadith, means stopping them from oppressing. It's about collective well-being and justice.
Okay. Another element discussed is the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a love's focal point.
Yes, the source argues he provided humanity with a perfect role model, someone who became the focus of immense love and devotion, revitalizing this divine sentiment.
He quotes that beautiful eulogy by Saadi Shirazi about his perfection and virtues.
And the anecdotes really drive this home. The Ansar woman at Uhud, losing her father, brother, husband, but her only concern is whether the prophet is safe.
Or Kubayb, facing execution, saying he wouldn't wish for the prophet to even suffer a thorn prick in exchange for his own safety.
And Urwa ibn Masud Thaqafi, a non-Muslim at the time, observing the companions how they'd literally scramble to follow his commands, cherish the water from his ablution, lower their voices, couldn't even look at him directly out of reverence. It shows an extraordinary level of love and respect.
So pulling all these threads together, God consciousness, self-critique, collective responsibility, this focal point of love, the source argues this led to a massive boost in personal dignity and transformation.
Absolutely. It revolutionized conduct, restored dignity, and crucially unlocked latent human potential. The source points directly to the transformation of the Arab nation from being described as backward and illiterate to becoming this major force.
Giving specific examples, Umar the shepherd becomes a brilliant administrator. Khalid ibn Walid, just a youth, becomes the sword of God. Salman Farsi rises from slavery to govern, yet lives simply.
It's presented as this incredible metamorphosis, turning herdsmen into rulers, scholars, leaders, directly fueled by this current of faith. And these weren't power-hungry individuals. They're portrayed as champions of justice, indifferent to personal gain, seeing their responsibility as a sacred trust for all people.
Wow, okay, that covers the moral and ethical side comprehensively. Let's shift now to that second lens, the intellectual scientific contributions.
Right. And the source starts by defining scientific thinking itself, disciplined inquiry, objective methods inspired by observing nature.
And it links this directly to the Quran.
Yes, quoting the very first revelation. Read by the name of your Lord who created. This is interpreted as a fundamental command to study the creation, to understand the Creator. It's seen as the driving force behind the innovative power.
The Quran itself is presented as inspiring intellect, providing ways of thinking, viewing nature as signs of God, ayat, pointing to a systematic order.
Exactly. It cites verses listing natural phenomena, heavens, earth, rain, wind, ships, as signs for those who use reason, and all those rhetorical questions. Can the blind be held equal to the seeing? Do you not understand? Prompts to observe camels, the sky, mountains.
This curiosity, fueled by faith, led to creative thinking, original work, and that massive translation effort we mentioned earlier.
Two key processes identified: developing new technologies and nurturing these incredibly creative analytical minds.
And a really interesting point the source makes is about harmonizing faith and science. It quotes Philip Hitti saying this is maybe the first time in human thought that theology, philosophy, and science were finally harmonized.
Which was a big deal. Before Islam, the source notes, some cultures worshipped parts of nature. Islam said, no, study nature. And then comes a really bold claim in the source.
Which is?
That Islam basically gave the scientific method to the world. Experimentation, observation, measurement.
That's huge. It contrasts this with the ancient Greeks, quoting Bertrand Russell about their supposed lack of experimentation.
Right. The anecdote about Aristotle and his wife's teeth may be apocryphal, but it makes the point. The source argues the Greeks had theories, but not the systematic experimental approach.
And it quotes the anthropologist Robert Briffault quite heavily here.
Extensively. Briffault argues modern science owes its very existence to the Arabs, not just specific discoveries. He emphasizes patient ways of investigation, the accumulation of positive knowledge, the minute method of science, detailed and prolonged observation and experimental inquiry, saying these were introduced by the Arabs.
He literally says the spirit and those methods were brought to Europe by them.
And Russell is quoted again, reinforcing this, saying, Muslims promoted science while Europe was in the Dark Ages, and that Islamic civilization flourished, preserving and advancing knowledge. It really positions this period as a crucial bridge.
Okay, let's get into some specifics then. Medicine first. The source calls the contributions here tremendous.
No understatement. It highlights key figures. Al-Razi, or Razis, often called the greatest physician of the era.
His works are mentioned Kitab al-Mansuri, that book on smallpox and measles, Al-Judari wal-Hasba, which the source claims is still authentic, and the huge Al-Hawi, a 20-volume encyclopedia.
And his contributions weren't just theoretical, gynecology, ophthalmology, yes, but also surgery credited with inventing the seton, using animal gut for sutures, and importantly using chemical compounds in medicine based on animal testing first. Very practical.
Then Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majusi, or Ali Abbas. His Kitab al-Maliki was standard before Avicenna, first to describe the capillary system, apparently, and detail childbirth accurately.
And then, of course, Avicenna Abu Ali al-Hussein al-Sina, just a giant intellectual figure. His Al-Qanun fil Tib, the Canons of Medicine.
Described as this monumental encyclopedia, 760 drugs, detailed discussion of diseases, pathology, waterborne illnesses, a whole pharmacopoeia, and its influence in Europe was just incredible.
Absolutely. Translated by Gerard of Cremona, reprinted hundreds of times. The source says it formed half the medical curriculum in European universities right up until 1650.
Wow. And surgery specifically, Abu al-Jarrah al-Zarali or Abu Qasis.
Another giant. His work Al-Tazrif was illustrated with surgical instruments, hugely influential east and west. He pioneered operating on blood vessels, suturing arteries with silk or even gold ligaments, developed plastic suturing techniques, designed designed new instruments.
And provided detailed descriptions for procedures like lithotomy, tonsillectomy, handling difficult births, even recommended female nurses for female patients. And his book, like Avicenna, was a standard text in Europe for centuries.
Ophthalmology, too, gets a specific mention specialists like Ali ibn Isa of Baghdad, whose work was authoritative in Europe, and Hunayn ibn Ishaq.
And we can't forget Al-Hasan Abu Ali al-Hassan on optics, corrected Euclid and Ptolemy. His work influenced Bacon, Kepler.
And his theory of vision, that light enters the eye from the object rather than rays coming from the eye, was a fundamental shift from the Greek view. Really groundbreaking.
The list goes on. Ibn Rushd, Averroes. Ibn Katina on the plague's contagious nature, Ibn Afi's discovering the pulmonary circulation before Harvey.
It's clear medicine was incredibly advanced, very focused on observation, experimentation, and practical treatment.
Okay, shifting to chemistry. The source makes an even bolder claim here. Unquestionably the invention of the Muslims.
It's a strong statement, yeah, but it argues they developed it systematically, becoming the authorities until the 17th century. Jabir ibn Hayyan Geber in the West is called the father of modern chemistry.
Credited with basic particle theory, identifying elements, perfecting lab processes like distillation, crystallization, sublimation.
First to get acetic acid from vinegar, pioneered large-scale glass use in labs. And again, the emphasis is on experimentation. The source quotes Homeyard, highlighting Jabir's scientific, systematic approach to understanding chemical changes, like calcination and reduction.
He prepared substances we still use: cinnabar, arsenic oxide, sulfuric, and nitric acids. Many chemical terms apparently come from his work.
Huge practical applications, too. Refining metals, steel making, dyeing, varnishing, coloring glass. Invented a precision scale. Even had a theory of chemical combinations 1,000 years before Dalton. Identified alkalis, acids, salts. Just foundational stuff.
And Al-Razi again built on this. His secret of secrets classified substances, and he meticulously documented experiments, methods, materials, conditions. He even described his lab setup. Apparently had over 20 instruments.
And Al-Majridi from Andalusia gets credit for first mentioning mass conservation centuries before Lavoisier. That's pretty remarkable.
These chemistry advances naturally led to pharmacology becoming a distinct field focused on practical remedies.
Exactly. People like Sabur ibn Sal started compiling pharmacopoeias. Al-Biruni wrote about drug properties and the pharmacist's role.
Ibn Sina listed 700 preparations. Works by others like Ibn Masawayh al-Maridini and Ibn al-Wafid were hugely popular in Latin translation.
Al-Zahrawi, the surgeon, also contributed here, preparing medicines through sublimation and distillation. His Liber Servitoris detailed preparations and recipes, including non-alcoholic distilled products.
Abu Amos al-Muwaffaq distinguished carbonates, noted poisons, described distilling seawater for drinking.
The source summarizes the types of pharmacological works listed by the scholar Levy: formularies, poison guides, synonym lists, materia medica, substitute drugs, a really developed field.
Okay, finally, mathematics. Significant contributions from the 8th century on, mixing Greek and Indian ideas, influenced sometimes by geometric art.
The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was key here, that translation hub. And the towering figure is Al-Khwarizmi Algorithmi in the West.
His book title, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtar fi Sab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, gives us the word algebra from algebra. He systemized solving equations, right?
Yes, polynomial equations up to the second degree. It was revolutionary because it moved math beyond just geometry, creating this abstract language for quantities and relationships, the foundation of modern algebra.
And his other huge contribution was popularizing the Hindu-Arabic numerals we use today, 1, 2, 3.
Right. His book explaining how to use them, Kitab al-Jam wa Tafriq bi Isab al-Hind, led to his name giving us the word algorithm. He saw how much more powerful they were for calculation than, say, Roman numerals. He also produced important trig tables.
Then Muhammad al-Karaji took algebra further, freeing it more from geometry, introducing algebraic calculus concepts.
And he's credited as the first to use mathematical induction for proofs, like for the binomial theorem, way before Pascal got associated with a triangle.
Omar Khayyam the poet, also a mathematician.
Yeah.
Generalized root extraction, worked on cubic equations systematically.
His work on algebra transmitted key ideas to Europe. And Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, he treated trigonometry as its own distinct field, separate from astronomy, and did extensive work on spherical trig.
Others mention, too, Thabit ibn Qurra on amicable numbers, Ibn al-Haytham, Heisen again, linking algebra and geometry.
It's an incredible list across the board.
So, we've traced this amazing arc from these profound moral and ethical shifts that reshaped a whole society, unleashing potential, to these absolutely fundamental contributions in medicine, chemistry, mathematics that, well, help build the modern world intellectual toolkit.
It really paints a picture of centuries of dynamic, vibrant intellectual life and deep moral conviction, all intertwined and driven, according to the source, by the core principles of the faith.
Which brings us to the final section of the chapter where the author transitions from celebrating this legacy to looking at the present and future. And it's a pretty challenging assessment, isn't it?
It is. The author concludes, in their view, that Muslims today are somewhat stuck to the past and haven't managed to create what they call a truly Islamic modern existence.
This is presented as the author's specific diagnosis within the source material. The idea being that Islam had the potential to lead this kind of development if properly understood and applied today.
And the author points a finger, so to speak, at what they see as a lack of real ijtihad, that's independent reasoning, interpreting Islamic law for modern times. This lack, the author argues, has held Muslims back from achieving peace, prosperity, and their full potential.
Leading to the author posing that pretty direct question.
Right. How do Muslims want to be in the world? What kind of people? Defined by their actions. It's a call for self-reflection.
And the call to action connects right back to the history we've discussed. For Muslims to arise out of deep slumber and reform themselves, drawing on the dynamism and principles of that successful past.
The alternative presented by the author is stark. It references Quran 9.24, interpreting it as a warning that if Muslims don't reform, God's decision may not be to our liking, implying further trials or even being replaced by others who will uphold the principles. It lends a real sense of urgency to the author's call.
So the whole detailed exploration of the history, the scientific breakthroughs, the moral courage, the collective responsibility serves, in the author's argument, as both evidence of past greatness and the blueprint for navigating the future.
Exactly. The source uses that historical weight to say, look what was possible, look at the potential that the author believes is still there if these principles are reignited.
We've certainly covered a huge amount in this deep dive, from the incredible breadth of contributions across so many fields,
To the author's specific take on how that legacy connects to contemporary challenges and the path forward as they see it, it really does showcase a transformative period in world history.
Absolutely. A period whose scientific methods and ethical ideas had ripples far beyond its own time and place.
And we've tried to present the author's perspective on the contrast between that past dynamism and their assessment of the present and the call to action that stems from it.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to mull over. Thinking about this history of vibrant intellectual inquiry and profound moral conviction, how might those core principles, as described in the source, inform efforts to shape communities and contribute to global knowledge in any context today?
That really does seem to be the question simmering beneath the surface of the whole chapter, doesn't it? Taking lessons from that rich past for whatever challenges lie ahead.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.